Hey everyone, this is Anna from the Sommpour. Around this time, before every D3 exam, I start getting the same question. Anna, what do you think is going to come up? And every year I give pretty much the same answer. I don't try to predict papers. But this year I thought, what if we stop trying to guess individual questions and instead try to understand the examiner? So I went back to every current format D3 theory paper from October 2019 through to May 2026. And then I looked at the tasting papers over the same period. I coded every question, looked at how the papers were constructed, tracked which chapters came up, how often they came up, and more importantly, what within those chapters had actually been examined. Because a chapter appearing 3 or 4 times doesn't necessarily mean it's exhausted. Burgundy is probably the best example of that. The chapter has appeared repeatedly, but there are still major assessment units that have never been directly tested. That became the basis of this report. This is not a prediction of the October paper. None of us knows what WSET will ask. What it is a structured assessment of where I think the examiner still has the strongest assessment space after 14 papers. And whether you agree with every conclusion or not, my hope is that you'll come away thinking a little differently about how D3 questions are built, and hopefully a little more strategically about how you spend the next 12 weeks. Before I get anywhere near the forecast, I want to show you how I got there. One of the mistakes I think we all make, including me in previous years, is jumping straight from the paper to predictions. Australia hasn't come up for a while. Surely Bordeaux can't come up again. So I built a series of filters. I started with every current format D3 theory and tasting paper from October 2019 onwards. The first question I asked was, how does the examiner actually build a paper? That is, the architecture of the question. How many are regional? How many are country questions, variety questions, comparison questions? What command verbs keep appearing? Once I understood the architecture, I looked at topic rotation. Which chapters are examiner favorites? Which come up regularly? Which only appear occasionally? But that still wasn't enough. I needed to start treating each chapter as not as a single topic. I broke every chapter into its major assessment units. Take Burgundy. We don't just have Burgundy, we have Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Chablis, Côte d'Or hierarchy, trade, climate, viticulture. Each of those can be assessed separately. Then I asked two final questions. First, how much meaningful assessment space still remains? In other words, after 14 papers, what hasn't been explored? And second, something I ended up calling assessment debt. Not just what's untested, but how long it's been since a major part of that chapter was substantially assessed. Only after a chapter had gone through all those filters did it make it into the final report. So what you're going to see isn't a list of regions that feel due. It's the outcome of a structured process that tries to understand how the examiner has used and not yet fully used the syllabus. Let's go through those filters one by one. I deliberately limited myself to the current D3 specification, beginning with the first current format paper in October 2019 and running through to May 2026. That gave me 14 theory papers and 14 tasting papers to work with. I didn't just read through them. Every theory question was coded. Every tasting flight was logged. I built spreadsheets tracking question architecture, chapter rotation, command verbs, assessment lenses, and eventually assessment units within each chapter. One decision I made quite early on was not to include papers from the previous specification, prior to 2019. They're interesting to form a historical perspective, but the current examiner has been remarkably consistent in how these papers are constructed, and I wanted to analyze and reflect the exam that you're actually sitting in October. It's also worth saying that 14 papers is not a huge data set. We're not dealing with hundreds of observations. So this is not statistical modeling, it's pattern recognition. The value comes from looking for consistency across every paper rather than trying to force a prediction from one or two sittings. And so with this foundation in place, I started asking, how does the examiner actually build a D3 theory paper? The first thing I looked at, not what the examiner was asking, but how the examiner asked it. Was it a regional question? Was it a country question? Was it a cross-regional variety question? Or one of the much rarer theme questions? Then I looked at command verbs. Explain, compare, assess, describe, outline. They're not interchangeable. They tell you exactly what kind of thinking the examiner expects. I also coded what is called assessment lenses. In other words, what was the examiner actually assessing? Was it the growing environment, viticulture, winemaking, style quality, regulations, market and commercial factors? Very quickly, some patterns started to emerge. Regional questions dominate the paper. Country questions appear consistently, but in smaller numbers. Variety questions almost always compare expressions across different regions rather than asking you to write everything you know about a single grape. And theme questions are actually quite rare. That's an important discovery because it meant I couldn't simply forecast chapters. Whatever I predicted also had to fit the examiner's preferred architecture. For example, if I thought Tempranillo was likely, it made much more sense as the paper's varietal question than as another Rioja regional essay. Likewise, if Australia appeared, I had to ask whether it was more likely to be a country assessment or a regional technical question. Understanding that question architecture became the framework of everything that followed. So I tracked every D3 chapter across all 14 theory papers and built what I called the topic rotation ledger. Some patterns were immediately obvious. Certain chapters are clear examiner favorites. Bordeaux, Burgundy, California, and Germany appear again and again. Other chapters rotate regularly, while some have only appeared once or twice. That's when I realized that frequency on its own is a poor predictor. Take Burgundy. It's appeared 5 times under the current specification. By that logic, you might think it's exhausted. But when I look more closely, it wasn't. The examiner has revisited Burgundy through different parts of the chapter. Trade, Chardonnay, hierarchy. But other assessment units, like a dedicated Côte d'Or red wine question, is still unexamined. The opposite is true for some chapters that have appeared only once. A single question can sometimes consume a surprisingly large part of the available assessment space. So topic rotation became an important filter, but it's not the deciding one. It told me how often the examiner returns to a chapter. It didn't yet tell me what within that chapter had actually been assessed. And that's where the next layer completely changed the analysis. Instead of treating Burgundy, Australia, or Chile as single topics, I started breaking every chapter into its individual assessment units. Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Chablis, Côte d'Or hierarchy, trade, climate, viticulture. Each one became its own assessment unit. Then I did exactly the same thing for every chapter in the syllabus. Australia wasn't just Australia anymore. It became Tasmania, Hunter Valley, Clare and Eden Valley Riesling, Margaret River, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Shiraz, and so on. South Africa became Swartland, Stellenbosch, Pinotage, Chenin Blanc, the wine of origin system. Spain became Tempranillo, Rioja, Catalonia, Central Spain. Once I started looking at the syllabus in this way, it became obvious that a chapter could appear 4 or 5 times and still have major assessment units that have never been directly examined. Equally, a chapter that had appeared only once might actually have very little meaningful assessment space left. So now I started asking a much better question. Which parts of Burgundy has the examiner already used, and which parts are still available? And that became the foundation of the next 2 filters. Once every chapter was broken into assessment units, I could finally ask how much meaningful assessment space actually remains. And I want to stress on the word meaningful. I'm not talking about a tiny paragraph in the D3 textbook that hasn't been tested yet. I'm asking whether there's enough material there to support the kind of integrated 100-mark essay the examiner wants us to write. So let me continue using Burgundy as an example. If I simply looked at topic rotation, I'd probably conclude that Burgundy has been examined enough. But when I look at the assessment units, the picture changed. Trade has been examined. Chardonnay has been examined. The hierarchy had been touched on. But a dedicated regional essay on Côte d'Or red wines, looking at site, mid-slopes, Pinot Noir, viticulture, style, quality, price, that assessment space was still largely available. I found the same pattern across the syllabus. Some chapters that seemed finished actually had plenty of room left. Others that appeared only once had already consumed much of their major assessment units. So at this stage, I'm asking, if I were the examiner, is there still enough here to write a fresh, balanced D3 question? That question eliminated quite a few chapters and pushed others much higher up the list. And the final filter came almost by accident. By this stage, I'd identified chapters with significant remaining assessment space, but I still had a problem. Some chapters looked equally strong. Take Northeast Italy and Southern Italy. Both still have substantial assessment units that haven't been fully explored. So how do you separate them? That's when I started looking at something I ended up calling assessment debt. It's simply the length of time since a major part of that chapter was last substantially assessed. Northeast Italy is a good example. Yes, Soave appeared in 2021 and Friuli in 2022. But if you look at the rest of the chapter, Valpolicella, Prosecco, Trentino Alto Adige, Alpine viticulture, there are still major assessment units that haven't been examined for several years, or at all, under the current specification. By contrast, other parts of Italy have been revisited much more recently. Piedmont has come back through Nebbiolo. Central Italy returned in 2025. Southern Italy also reappeared in 2025. So, although all three parts of Italy still have assessment space, Northeast Italy has built up the greatest assessment debt. And that's really how I use this filter. It became the tiebreaker. When a chapter had both substantial remaining assessment space and a long period since its last meaningful assessment, it naturally moved up higher in the final report. And once I applied all 5 filters, I had a shortlist that I felt was evidence-based rather than instinctive. So let me show you how these 5 filters narrowed the entire D3 syllabus down to the final shortlist. I started with the entire D3 syllabus, 30 chapters covering every major wine-producing region in the world. Breaking those chapters down gave us well over 100 individual assessment units to work with. Then, one by one, each assessment unit went through the same process. Did it fit the examiner's preferred question architecture? How often had that chapter appeared? Which assessment units had already been substantially examined? How much meaningful assessment space still remained? How much assessment debt had built up? Some chapters consistently rose to the top because they scored well across every filter. Others dropped away, not because they're not examinable, but because the examiner had already used a substantial part of their assessment space under the current spec. And that left me with 13 high priority chapters. From those, I identified 7 primary forecasts and a second tier of strong alternatives. Now, I want to be very clear about one thing. This does not mean that other chapters cannot appear. They absolutely can. What this report is really saying is that if I had to prioritize my revision over the next 12 weeks, these are the chapters I'd spend the most time on first. And that's where we'll finish today with the final assessment report. Let's begin with the highest confidence group. Australia remains one of the examiner's anchor chapters. But the key finding was that the remaining assessment space isn't generic Australia. It's concentrated in specific parts of the chapter. Hunter Valley Semillon, Tasmania as a premium cool climate region, Clare and Eden Valley Riesling, and the contrast between established and emerging premium regions all remain largely untouched as standalone assessment units. South Africa also moved much higher up than I expected. The examiner had already used the country's commercial story, Chenin Blanc, and regional comparisons. What's still sitting there is Swartland, Stellenbosch, old vines, Mediterranean climate, dry farming, site selection, and premium red wine production, all of which fit beautifully into integrated regional essays that D3 tends to prefer. Spain stayed firmly in the top group, but not because I think Rioja is coming back again. Rioja regulations have been examined, aging classifications have been examined, white Spain has been examined. What's left is broader regional diversity, Catalonia, Northwest Spain, and perhaps most importantly, Tempranillo as a cross-regional variety through Rioja, Ribera del Duero, and Toro. Then there's Burgundy, which is probably the best example of why assessment units matter more than chapter frequency. Burgundy has appeared several times through different lenses. Trade, Chardonnay, hierarchy. What's still largely available is a technical regional essay on the Côte d'Or Reds, bringing together site, Pinot Noir, viticulture, quality, price into one integrated answer. The next 3 chapters also scored very highly. Northeast Italy climbed significantly once I introduced assessment debt. Soave and Friuli have appeared, but Valpolicella, Amarone, Prosecco, Trentino Alto Adige, Prosecco would probably be in D4, and Alpine Viticulture remain substantial assessment units that haven't been fully explored under the current spec. Washington State has usually appeared alongside Oregon or New York. It still feels like one of those few major regions capable of supporting a standalone essay or even a comparative essay through continental climate, irrigation, site selection, and varietal suitability. And New Zealand remains a strong possibility, not through another Sauvignon Blanc question, but as a broader country assessment looking at regional diversity, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, aromatic whites, sustainability, and the country's evolving premium reputation. I've also separated out the most likely variety question, because that's a different part of the paper architecture. After reviewing every variety question under the current spec, the last 14 papers, Tempranillo came out as my strongest candidate. It gives the examiner exactly what they like. One grape expressed across multiple regions, allowing candidates to compare growing environments, viticulture, winemaking, style, and quality. The strongest alternative is Zinfandel. Once California was broken into assessment units, Zinfandel emerged as the strongest candidate. It also supports a rich comparative discussion through California, Primitivo, and its historical origins. And finally, there are what I call strong alternatives. Germany, Austria, southern Italy, Portugal, Chile, and China all still contain significant assessment units that could comfortably support a D3 question if the examiner chooses a different balance for the paper. The tasting paper was a little different to analyze. For theory, I could look at question architecture, assessment units, and remaining assessment space. The tasting paper has another layer of complexity because the examiner isn't just choosing topics, they're also building 4 balanced flights using commercially available wines. So I'd treat this assessment as directional rather than predictive. My confidence here is a little lower than it is for the theory paper. For the varietal flight, Cabernet Sauvignon remains my strongest candidate. It hasn't appeared as the varietal flight since 2022. It's one of the world's benchmark grapes, and it gives the examiner enormous stylistic range across countries and climates. If it isn't Cabernet Sauvignon, my strongest alternatives would be Chenin Blanc, Merlot, and Syrah or Shiraz. All 4 are internationally important varieties with enough stylistic diversity to support a calibration flight. For the country flight, New Zealand stands out. It hasn't appeared since the very first current format paper in October 2019. And the country offers far more than Sauvignon Blanc. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Syrah, aromatic whites all provide enough diversity for a balanced country flight. You'll notice I've marked New Zealand with an asterisk. That's because this assessment doesn't look at the tasting paper in isolation. It looks at the theory and tasting papers together. If New Zealand appears as a major country or regional assessment in the theory paper, I think it becomes less likely to reappear as the tasting country flight. If it doesn't feature in theory, then I think it becomes one of the strongest tasting candidates. If not New Zealand, I'd be looking at France, the USA, or Portugal. The regional flight is probably the most interesting. Moselle remains my strongest candidate. It's been absent from the regional flight rotation for several years and has a very distinctive regional identity that lends itself well to calibration. Again, California and Rioja are marked with an asterisk. If Zinfandel appears as the theory variety question, I think California becomes less likely as the regional tasting flight because historically the examiner has generally avoided obvious overlap between theory and tasting. Similarly, if Spain forms one of the major regional assessments in the theory paper, Rioja becomes a less likely tasting candidate. If Spain doesn't feature in theory, Rioja immediately becomes a stronger regional candidate. I'd then keep Rhone and Alsace as my strongest unconditional alternatives. So, rather than treating the two papers as completely independent, I think it's more useful to think about them together. One paper doesn't determine the other, but over the last 14 sittings, the examiner has often used theory and tasting to broaden syllabus coverage rather than concentrate on the same regions or varieties across both days. That doesn't mean there are no exceptions. It simply means I think it's another small piece of evidence that's worth factoring into the assessment. So, just as with the theory report, this is not a prediction of the tasting flights. It's simply my assessment of where the strongest probabilities lie after analyzing every current format tasting paper alongside theory paper. And if I were planning my tasting over the next 12 weeks, these are the flights I'd spend proportionally more time calibrating. Before we finish, I want to leave you with one final thought. It's very easy to watch something like this and come away thinking, I've just told you what's going to be on the October paper. I have not. Nobody outside the examining team knows that. What this report represents is an evidence-based assessment built from the current specification. It's my attempt to understand how the examiner has used the syllabus over the last 14 theory papers and where the strongest remaining assessment space exists. It's a revision tool. It's not a prediction tool. In fact, if WSET chose to set a paper built entirely around Bordeaux, California, the Loire, and Tocage, they absolutely could. Every chapter in the textbook remains examinable until the exam is over. The value of this report isn't that it narrows the syllabus. The value is that it helps you prioritize it. If you have 12 weeks left and you can't give every chapter the same amount of attention, this gives you a structured way of deciding where to spend proportionally more of your time. And I'd encourage you to think the same way beyond this report. Don't ask yourself what's going to come up. Ask yourself, if I were the examiner, where is there still enough assessment space to write a balanced D3 question? I think that's a much more useful question, and it's the one that guided this entire project. So with 12 weeks left until the exam, let me show you how I'd actually use this report to structure my revision. The first few weeks would be about making sure every chapter is fundamentally understood. By now, you're not trying to memorize more facts. You're trying to strengthen your cause and effect chain that sits behind every chapter. Once you've done that, start weighting your revision. The chapters we've identified today, Australia, South Africa, Burgundy, Spain, and the rest, would simply receive more of my study time. Not all of it, just more of it. The second thing I'd do is stop reading quite so much and start writing. D3 is not a memory test, it is an explanation test. Can you take a blank sheet of paper and explain why a wine tastes the way it does? Can you connect growing environment to viticulture, viticulture to fruit composition to winemaking, and finally to style, quality, and price? That's the skill that earns marks. I'd also spend much more time planning essays. You don't need to write a full answer. Sometimes just spending 10 minutes planning an introduction, deciding on your structure, and thinking through the logical flow is incredibly valuable. The same applies to tasting. Don't just identify wines. Ask yourself why they taste the way they do. What chapter does this remind you of? What growing conditions produce these aromas? What growing conditions relate closer to a theory question. Could this wine become a theory question? That's where theory and tasting start reinforcing each other instead of feeling like two separate exams. And finally, in the last couple of weeks, I would shift completely into exam mode. Timed essays, timed tastings, practice planning under pressure, building confidence in the process rather than trying to learn another 50 pages of the textbook. Because at this stage, success doesn't come from knowing a little bit more. It comes from being able to organize what you already know into a clear, logical D3 answer. So I'd finally love to hear, as we conclude, one thing I'd like you to take away is don't spend the next 12 weeks chasing predictions. That's never been the point of this exercise. The point has been to show you a different way of looking at the syllabus. Every D3 question, whether it's Burgundy, South Africa, Rioja, or Hunter Valley, is really asking you the same thing. Can you explain why? Why does this region produce this style of wine? Why does one producer make different decisions from another? Why does this grape behave differently here than somewhere else? If you can answer those questions clearly, logically, and consistently, you'll be ready for whatever appears on the paper. And remember, this report does not reduce the syllabus, it simply helps you prioritize it. Use it as a guide to where you might spend a little more of your revision time, but don't let it become a reason for you to ignore the rest of the workbook. I hope it helps you make D3 feel a little less like a game of guessing and a little more like a paper you can prepare for more systematically and strategically. Good luck with your revision. I'll see many of you in my study circles over the coming weeks. Please do reach out if you need any help or any questions. Thank you and all the best.